Get started, folks. Welcome to today's Crease Brownbag. Before we get started, I have a few things that I just want to mention in passing. We're coming to the end of the semester, so this will be our last Brownbag of the semester. But we do have a couple of events on Friday, including in the morning at 9 a.m. Here at Bailey 318. We're going to have our Crease Stop Day meeting. So if you're affiliated with the program, if you're a friend of Crease, faculty, student, we welcome your presence here. This is our sort of chance to gather and catch up on what we accomplished, what's been done over the course of the semester, and also talk a little bit about what we foresee doing in the future. And then that evening, it'll turn over to fun, and we'll have a holiday party over at the, we've been having this for several years or several times at the old train depot, the Lawrence Information Center. And so we'll be meeting there from 5 to 8. We invite you to come, bring your friends, family. It's potluck, and the emphasis this year is on desserts, sweets, and so we invite you to come and join as we celebrate the end of the semester. So our speakers today are John Gilling, who's the Associate Librarian for Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the KU Libraries, and Marianne Reed, who is Digital Initiatives Coordinator, and so they're going to be sharing with us something about which they know quite a bit as far as Russian and U.S. copyright and deciphering.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bart, and thank you to Crease for letting us come and talk for a few minutes about a little bit about copyright. We're not experts on copyright, but we received a question recently about copyright related to one of our books.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to kind of share what we learned, and hopefully if any of you run into problems with copyright where you have to seek out copyright holders in order to publish something in your book or whatever question you might have regarding copyright, this might point you in the right direction. So that's kind of our brief introduction. Copyright really is kind of an enigma on a number of levels, and we'll get into that as we talk.
Especially when you're dealing with international copyright, multiple countries involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let Marianne kind of talk about the question that we received and kind of how it proceeded through the conversation.
So it all started with the art library having a book that had its maps stolen, removed. Somehow the maps had gotten separated from the book and were no longer available. And this is not necessarily a very rare book, but the maps, other libraries have also lost these maps. And so evidently the art library talked to another library that had the maps into lending them to us so we could digitize them. And after we digitized them, the question was, well, what can we do with them? Is this thing in the public domain so that we could post it online? Can we lend it out to other libraries and things like that? And so it became a multidisciplinary question involving, it involved the art library, the Slavic and Near Eastern librarians, the preservation staff, and our interlibrary loan staff. And that's just the high level of who was involved in this. So, but that's essentially the gist of the question and what we were trying to figure out. And I'll just go back to John, and John can talk a little bit about the piece.
Okay, so these were the two maps that were in the back of the piece. Mm-hmm. The library record shows that there are two folded maps, and they're actually quite large in size. So they mentioned in the conversation that it would be difficult to reproduce them physically. They could have done it, but our colleagues felt that a digital version might be easier to produce and make it more accessible. So the first, as you can see, is a planning map of Moscow. That's the one on the left, the schema. And then on the right, you have this map of major thoroughfares and waterways. Not just waterways, but water bodies as well. I think the word is, let's see, what is it?
Waterways and green spaces.
Yeah, and green spaces. I had to look this word up because I'd never heard of that word before. Anyway, so it's quite interesting, and these were produced in 1936. Originally, Jeff was contacted about the question, and then because this had to do with Russia, and I may have had more conversations about copyright in the past from professional conferences and other colleagues, so he then referred it on to me as well. So I want to give you a little bit of background about the book itself.
Are you ready for me?
Yeah, go ahead. So this is the cover of the book. You can see it in Russian. If you read Russian, it's literally a general plan for reconstruction of the city of Moscow. So, and it's published by, the translation is Moscow Laborer, or Moskovskaya Rabochaya. And that was published in 1936. So that was the publisher that distributed quite a few copies of this. But we also checked the colophon to see if there was any additional publication information or copyright statement, because if there's a copyright statement there, then that, we know exactly who would have held the copyright. But if there's no, little C there, no copyright or copyright statement, then we have to kind of track down, try to figure out who actually was the copyright holder. So this was an image from the copyright statement. And do you have a pointer, one of those laser pointers I could use?
I gave one.
So if you read Russian, you can see that it was printed in its sample public printing by the Oghis of the Russian Federation of the Soviet Union. And the Oghis is the Association of State Book and Journal Publishers. So the original printing was produced by this organization. And it was actually printed by a trust of the Oghis, and that was called Politgrafkniga, Politichskaya Grafichskaya Kniga. And you can see that's, oh, there it is. Which one is it?
It's that middle button. Turn around the other way, John.
Middle, the little red arrow? Oh, there it is. So this was the trust, or the kind of subunit, Politgrafkniga of the Association of Publishers here. And that organization morphed into other organizations. In the Soviet Union, they went through several iterations and name changes of different types. So this was a government body. So anyway, we had this information. So I looked up an article in the Slavic and East European Information Resources Journal, and I found an article which seemed to answer the question in relation to this copyright question. And it seemed that this item was in the public domain according to that article. However, later there were several other copyright questions that came across the Slavic librarian's listserv. And I was involved in some of the discussion around those questions. And so I brought up this article that I had found in the SEIR, S-E-I-R journal. And it turns out that information was actually incorrect. So it was published, I believe, in like 2002 or 2004. I'd have to check the citation. But it was kind of an attempt, and it was to kind of give a sense of what materials are under copyright at that point in Russia. But it was given to, it was a quote from the Russian Book Chamber. And they actually made a mistake. They weren't, attorneys, they weren't lawyers, they weren't copyright experts. And so I found out that article was incorrect. And thankfully, my colleague, Janice Pilch at Rutgers, she kind of caught this and alerted me to the problem. So she sent me her article, which she published in Slavic Review, and that's a more detailed presentation of actually Russian copyright, which, with a lot of international copyright, really is a labyrinth. So here's a picture of Janice and her contact information. So if you have a copyright question related to Russia or Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, this is one of your first resources, the human resource. She answers approximately 50 copyright questions per year. So she's basically the ACES expert on copyright. She's not an attorney, but she's also part of the WIPO, which is I don't know exactly. It's
World IP,
yeah,
intellectual
international
property.
yeah, something like that. So she's connected into these conversations about copyright and has published numerous articles about them. So,
Want me to go ahead and talk?
well, let's go to the next one.
Okay.
So this is her article. It's called U.S. Copyright Relations with Central East European and Eurasian Nations in Historical Perspective. So if you are trying to answer copyright questions or just for your own background, I would suggest that you read this article. It's not onerous. There's a lot of details, and sometimes it's easy to get lost in the details. But it's only about 23 pages long, so with significant notes. So it's reasonable, and it'll give you a general overview of the considerations when you're trying to figure out copyright holders. I'm not sure. Let's see. The next slide is.
Is your international copyright is governed by a series of treaties?
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and talk about? Yeah.
About what we found out?
Yeah. Let's talk about what we found out.
Well, one of the things that I was working at that point with the Schulenberger Office of Scholarly Communication and Copyright, which is in the libraries. And we take a lot of copyright questions from faculty and students and help people with things, help people figure out how fair use can apply, etc. And so this question having come to us, we have some backup in that somebody from the General Counsel's office is kind of our contact for things that if we are in a pickle and can't really figure out exactly how something would fall, and we don't tell anybody, by the way, if something is or is not in the public domain, that we're not lawyers, so we can't do that, but we can at least show you how copyright law works in the U.S. So we have this relationship with the General Counsel's office, and so I went to my contact there and I said, look, this is this really interesting question. This thing seems to have been published by the Soviet government around 1936-37, and we're trying to figure out if it's in the public domain. And if it is, if it's in the public domain, we can do a lot more things with it, including posting it online for other libraries to download. And so they did some research. They have a connection with an intern who is a specialist in international copyright. And they did a little bit of research, and the end result was that they essentially said that before the collapse of the Soviet Union, copyrights belonging to legal entities were valid for an unlimited time. So essentially copyright was forever before the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, then what happens is that copyrights that belong to those legal entities transferred back to the Russian government. And then there was a law that says that copyrights that were owned by entities prior to 1993 were given a 50-year term of copyright. So if you think about something that's done in the 50s, it was given a 50-year term of copyright. And again, I'm speaking in real generalities here because we know that individual situations are sometimes a little different, but this is just in general. And so if something was created in 1936 or 37, well, 50 years from that is expired. So it's in the public domain. That's kind of the high-level view of what we found out. One of the complexities of all this is that we're really dealing with two sets of copyright laws. We're dealing with the U.S. copyright laws, and you're dealing with the copyright laws in the country in which the item was produced. And so part of it is sort of looking at both and figuring out which one applies, or do they both apply in a little bit, or whatever. And what the one thing the intern came back and said is that generally they apply something called the rule of the shorter term. In other words, if there's copyright in two countries, copyright excuse me, let me rephrase that. If the copyright, if it was in the U.S., this is how copyright would apply. If it was in Russia, this is how copyright would apply. What the rule of shorter term is that whichever one has a shorter term of copyright is the one that applies between those two. If they subscribe to the rule of the shorter term, and the United States does, we follow the rule of the shorter term. Again, not a lawyer, so I'm sure there's more complexities in that. And so, since by U.S. copyright law, the book would be in the public domain, by Russian copyright law, the book would be in the public domain, we're going to treat it as if it's in the public domain. It's in the public domain in both places. And so it can be posted and made available to anybody because it's public work now. And so that's, what would you like to say? Do you have something to contribute?
No, it's fine. I just wanted to highlight some of the things in Janice's article. And one of the things that she mentions, and that we've started to talk about, is that these copyrights are governed by a series of treaties,
Mhm.
and each new treaty kind of throws another
Mhm.
wrench into the discussion, and I assume that it'll be ongoing.
Because the treaties are for the two countries deciding how they're going to honor each other's laws. You know, so I have this copyright law in my country, you have this copyright law in your country. Which one are we going to honor, so that we're not going and stealing other countries' works from the United States or vice versa? It's just a negotiation in terms of how you're going to honor each other's copyrights.
And sometimes Marianne and I were talking yesterday, and she said that in some cases treaties sometimes trump the home country's laws, depending on which government is or which is in power. If there's a good regime change, then it kind of throws another wrench into the situation, depending on whether that government is going to honor that treaty or not. So it's very complicated.
It is.
So one of the treaties that Janice mentions is the Berne Convention, and that was that convention occurred much earlier than 1989, but the United States joined the Berne Convention on March 1st in 1989. So essentially, when the United States joined that convention, they entered into copyright relations with Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, which had already adhered to the Berne Convention. And I'm pulling directly from Janice's article. After 1990, the United States entered into reciprocal copyright relations under the Berne Convention in quick succession with all the remaining post-communist nations of Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, except for Turkmenistan. Apparently, they became fully integrated into the international intellectual property regime. So I don't know why Turkmenistan kind of still stands out by itself, but so we are in copyright relations through the Berne Convention with all of these countries.
Yes.
And it also mentions that the Berne Convention restores copyright to many works that would formerly have been in the public domain, according to Russian copyright law. So you have to be careful. Something that one might have considered to be in the public domain after the Berne Convention, some things actually extend beyond the dates that were previously used as markers. So each case is an individual case and has to be addressed separately. I think we have enough time, so I want to give you an example that Janice brings out in her article, and this is an example of the works of Stalin. So I'm just going to read what she wrote, and it's a couple paragraphs. It's quite good, and it provides an example of an author-created work, whereas the case that we ran into was a work created by a government body. Okay, so Janice says that the works of Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, present an interesting, if glaring, example of the challenges involved in copyright determination today. On 1 January 1996, all of his works, published and unpublished, were protected in the Russian Federation through 2007, under a term of life plus 54 years, the special term for people who served or worked during World War II. In the United States, his works became eligible for copyright protection on 1 January 1996. The term of protection in the United States is determined by sections 301 to 305 of the 1976 U.S. Copyright Act as amended. So, she says, a work written by Stalin and published before 1923 is in the public domain in the United States. A work written by Stalin before 1923 and never published is protected in the United States for a term of life of the author plus 70 years, or 31 December 2002, I think I have whichever is greater. Thus it is protected through 2023. A work by Stalin, first published in Moscow in 1950, has a U.S. term of 95 years from publication and is therefore protected through 2045. So, depending on what category his works fall into, they can have different copyright dates.
And the difference between those categories was whether it was published or not published.
Published before 1923,
And the
or
date.
never published before 1920. Yeah, date of publication and whether it was published. Okay.
It's like playing 3D chess.
So the length of copyright protection in the Russian Federation is calculated differently. On 28 July 2004, the Russian Federation amended its 1993 copyright law, extending copyright terms by 20 years, from a general term of 50 years to 70 years, with an extra 4 years for World War II participation. So you see how difficult it is. You have to determine whether someone participated in World War II. The amendment applied to works still under copyright when it took effect.
And that amendment was done in what year?
2004.
Okay, so remember, since this thing was done in the 30s, the 50 years had expired already, so it was not in the, it was already in the public domain then.
Well, yes, but this is a work created by an author, and
That's true. It's different from the
so
governmental rating.
then again, it's a different category.
So true.
So the amendment applied to works still under copyright when it took effect. Stalin's works were still protected in Russia on 28 July 2004. Thus, the amendment applies, and copyright for his works has been extended to 2027. So if Stalin had not worked or served during World War II, his works would have expired in Russia in 2003, and the 2004 amendment would not have applied, and his works would be in the public domain in Russia today. But they received the benefit of the 2004 amendment and will be protected through 2027 in Russia. So, there's the enigma, right? Very complicated. And with that, I'll pass the word to Marianne.
Okay, so we have some international copyright resources that you might find helpful. One of the ones that is one of my favorites is the one that's kind of in the middle, the International Copyright Quick Reference Guide. I always like the word quick reference guide because one hopes that it can actually help quickly. UNESCO has a lovely collection of international copyright laws by country, and that's very helpful, especially if you're working with a country that is not a big country, not Russia or something, if you're working with a smaller country. And then there's a nice little article, again, Wikipedia, surprisingly enough, about what international copyright treaties have been done and who's signed on when, and that's kind of helpful. Let's see. So, what do you do when you want to use a work that's, or use large sections of a work that is, as far as you know, copyrighted, or you don't know that it's copyrighted? Well, first of all, you need to figure out if the countries that are involved signed treaties. Did we sign treaties with each other so that we kind of respect each other's copyright laws? And if so, what was the copyright law in the country that we're signing the treaty with? John has found that for Reese, Janice Pilch is really the expert. She's the person that seems to know the most on that, and that article is very good.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing to remember, though, is in the United States, fair use is here, and we use fair use to use works that are copyrighted or for which we would ordinarily have to have permission. So, one of the things to remember is, even if the thing is copyrighted, you can use, if you do a fair use analysis, and remember fair use analyses have 4 factors involved. If you do a fair use analysis and you consider it a fair use, then you can use it as long as you attribute it. Again, that's something you always have to be careful about. It's like you just want to make sure that you do the analysis and that you keep that analysis, because you want to do it on paper so that you keep it for later reference in case somebody comes back to you and says, hey, that's my thing, you shouldn't have used it. But fair use will, if you have determined that something's a fair use, you can go ahead and use those copyrighted materials. It doesn't matter if it's copyrighted. You're using it in a way that is legally okay, or at least that you've determined is legally okay. If any of you have done fair use analyses with the 4 factors?
Well,
I think we've done some together, but if you haven't, and anybody would ever like to go through that to try to figure out copyright and whether something is a fair use or not, let us know. The Schulenberger Office of Scholarly Communication and Copyright, it's a very large mouthful, but we're easy to reach. All you have to do is type copyright@ku.edu, and that'll get to us. And what we can do is we can sit down and walk you through some of these tools to determine whether something's a fair use or not, because in the long run, if it's not copyrighted, if it's in the public domain, then you can use whatever you want of it as long as you attribute, because that's good scholarly practice. But if it is copyrighted, then fair use is the way that you can use things, and it's very important to know that that's possible and how you can do it. So we'd be happy to help. Copyright questions, copyright@ku.edu. It's probably the easiest thing. I have handouts out there for our live guide for copyright resources that has a lot of resources, including a lovely thing called the ALA Digital Copyright Slider, which lets you kind of determine, well, okay, this factor and this factor and this factor, it's up here, and then it'll tell you whether it's in the public domain or not. That's very, very handy, especially for U.S. copyright things.
That was created by Michael Brewer, one of our Slavic librarians, so it's kind of nice to
Exactly.
know that.
Well, of course, because he's probably dealt with copyright so much that he just got sick of it and he wanted to make it easier.
Well, he and Janice actually work closely together on the copyright committee, so.
Yes.